In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania Dutch country, where limestone barns dot the landscape and the Conewago Creek cuts through farmland that German immigrants tilled for 2 centuries, there stands a structure so improbable, so wildly out of place, that its very existence poses a question no one wanted to ask for nearly a century. What kind of man builds a palace and then abandons it before the roof is finished? What compulsion drives a candy magnate to pour millions into constructing a Spanish-Moorish fantasy castle on a windswept hilltop overlooking a factory town named after himself, and why, after spending years obsessing over every tile, every carved stone, every imported beam, did Milton Hershey suddenly walk away, leaving High Point, his unfinished monument to ambition, to rot into Pennsylvania's most spectacular architectural ghost? Because this isn't the story you know about the Chocolate King, not the sanitized tale of the benevolent industrialist who gave workers a paradise and children a school, but rather the darker, more human story of a man whose inability to have children of his own transformed into an obsession with legacy so consuming that he built monuments he could never inhabit, created institutions that would outlive him by design, and in the process revealed the profound loneliness at the heart of American self-made mythology, the terrible isolation of men who build empires but cannot build families, and the question that haunted High Point from the moment its construction stopped in 1934 is the same question that haunts every abandoned palace. If you build your heaven on earth and then discover you don't want to live in it, what does that say about heaven, about earth, or about the American dream itself? Because Milton Hershey was born on September 13, 1857, in a farmhouse outside Derry Church, Pennsylvania, to Henry and Veronica Fanny Hershey, Mennonites whose ancestors had fled religious persecution in Switzerland generations earlier, seeking the tolerance that William Penn promised to German sectarians, and Milton's childhood was defined not by stability but by his father's serial failures, Henry Hershey's endless schemes to get rich quick, oil speculation in Pennsylvania, farming ventures in Colorado, attempts at invention that consumed family savings, and the constant moving, the constant uprooting, the profound instability that would later manifest in Milton's own inability to stay still, to be satisfied, to stop building even when every rational indicator said he should stop, and Milton attended 7 different schools in 8 years, never finishing 4th grade, his formal education ending when his mother, exhausted by Henry's failures, essentially gave up on keeping the family together in any conventional sense, and at 14 Milton was apprenticed to a printer, but he hated it, was fired within months. And then his mother made the decision that would change everything. She apprenticed him to Joseph Royer, a confectioner in Lancaster, and for 4 years Milton learned the alchemy of candy making, the precise temperatures required for different types of sugar work, the chemistry of caramel and the physics of chocolate, and more importantly, he learned that there was a kind of magic in creating sweetness, a power in manufacturing pleasure that could transcend class and geography, because everyone, rich and poor, wanted candy, and in 1876, at age 19, with $150 borrowed from his Aunt Mattie, Milton opened his first candy shop in Philadelphia, and it failed, spectacularly. Within 6 years, the centennial exhibition crowds he'd counted on didn't materialize in sustainable numbers, his inexperience with business management destroyed him, and he returned to Lancaster bankrupt and humiliated. But unlike his father, Milton didn't spiral into bitterness. Instead he traveled to Denver, worked for another confectioner, learned a new technique for making caramel using fresh milk instead of paraffin, returned to Lancaster in 1883. And with new loans from family and banks, launched the Lancaster Caramel Company, and this time, through a combination of his new recipe, relentless work, and luck, a large order from an English candy importer in 1886 who tasted his caramels at a trade show, Milton finally succeeded, and by 1894 he was employing 1,400 workers and his company was worth over $1 million. And in 1898, at age 40, he married Catherine "Kitty" Sweeney, a beautiful Irish Catholic woman from Jamestown, New York, whom he'd met in a candy shop. She was shopping, he was checking on a retail account, and their marriage was by all accounts genuinely loving, a true partnership, though it scandalized both families, the Mennonite Hersheys appalled by the Catholic connection, the Sweeneys uncertain about this older, driven businessman who seemed to care more about candy than anything else, but Milton and Kitty were devoted to each other. And she became his confidant, his advisor, the person who could calm his obsessive work habits and draw him into something resembling normal life, and then in 1900, at age 43, Milton made a decision that shocked everyone. He sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million in cash, keeping only the chocolate-making equipment, which he'd been experimenting with since visiting the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where he'd seen German chocolate-making machinery, and he announced he was going to manufacture milk chocolate, not as a luxury item for the wealthy but as a mass-market product that ordinary Americans could afford, and this was considered insane, because in 1900 chocolate was expensive, imported, elite, made primarily in Switzerland and sold in fancy shops, and the idea that a Pennsylvania Dutchman could figure out how to make milk chocolate in industrial quantities at competitive prices seemed delusional. But Milton had a vision. He would build a factory in the middle of dairy country, use fresh milk from local farms, and create a vertically integrated operation that controlled every step from cocoa bean to finished bar, and after 2 years of failed experiments, milk chocolate was notoriously difficult to make. The milk solids interacted with cocoa butter in ways that created grainy, unstable products. He finally perfected a formula, and in 1903 he broke ground on a new factory. Not in Lancaster but 30 miles away, in the middle of nowhere, on farmland he'd purchased near his birthplace, and this decision was the first sign of what would become Milton's defining characteristic. He didn't just want to make chocolate, he wanted to build a world, a complete, controlled environment where every aspect of production and life could be optimized, rationalized, perfected according to his vision, and so the factory rose from the cornfields, a massive brick structure with the latest technology. And around it Milton began to build a town, not company housing in the grim 19th century sense but a planned community with tree-lined streets, substantial homes, parks, and amenities, because Milton believed, or claimed to believe, that happy workers were productive workers, that providing quality housing and recreation wasn't charity but sound business practice, though historians would later debate whether this was genuine benevolence or sophisticated control, because the company owned everything. And living in Hershey meant living under the constant gaze of management, your home and your job inseparable, your entire existence dependent on Milton's goodwill and the chocolate factory's success. But the workers, many of them recent immigrants or farmers' sons seeking industrial wages, didn't complain. By the standards of 1900s industrial America, Hershey was paradise. The homes had indoor plumbing, the streets were paved, there was a department store and a bank and eventually a trolley system, and most importantly, the work was steady and the pay was decent, and the chocolate factory prospered beyond Milton's wildest projections. His Hershey's milk chocolate bar, sold for a nickel, became ubiquitous across America, the company supplying the U.S. Army with chocolate rations during World War I, cementing its association with American identity itself, and by 1918 Milton Hershey was one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, his company valued at over $20 million. His town growing from a few hundred to several thousand residents, and he had become, despite his fourth-grade education and Mennonite roots, a captain of industry, a peer of Carnegie and Rockefeller in the pantheon of American self-made men. But there was a wound at the center of this success, a silence in the mansion where Milton and Kitty lived, because they had no children, and in the early 1900s this wasn't merely disappointing, it was tragic, a mark of failure, a violation of social and biological expectation, especially for people of their generation and religious background, and Kitty suffered from what was likely a progressive muscular disorder, possibly muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis. The medical records are unclear, but by 1910 she was increasingly frail, spending more time resting, less able to travel, and the couple, both approaching 50, had to accept that they would never have biological children, and this acceptance manifested not in resignation but in action. Because in 1909 Milton and Kitty established the Hershey Industrial School, initially for orphaned white boys from Pennsylvania, and they didn't just endow it with a check, they deeded the school $1 million in chocolate company stock and later their entire fortune, structuring their wills so that the school would inherit everything, would own the company outright, would become the perpetual beneficiary of the chocolate empire, and this was unprecedented, a childless couple essentially making an institution their heir. And the school opened in 1910 with 10 students on a farm Milton had purchased, and it was not a charity in the traditional sense but a working farm school where orphaned boys would learn agriculture, trades, and Christian values while also receiving academic education, and Milton and Kitty were deeply involved, visiting regularly, knowing students' names, and for a brief period it seemed like they had found a solution to their childlessness, a way to be parents to many instead of few. But then in 1915, after months of declining health, Kitty died at age 42, and Milton, at 58, was shattered, his grief so profound that those who knew him said he was never the same. The relentless optimism that had characterized his early life dimmed into something harder, more driven, more obsessive, because without Kitty there was no one to tell him to stop working, to come home, to remember that life existed outside the factory, and Milton plunged deeper into building, expanding the town, adding a community building, a park, a zoo, a sports arena, a golf course, a massive luxury hotel. Called the Hotel Hershey, which opened in 1933, during the Depression, when building luxury hotels was economically insane but provided construction jobs for Hershey workers who otherwise would have been laid off, and every project was about control, about creating a complete world where nothing was left to chance, where every tree was planted according to a master plan, every building designed to fit a coherent aesthetic. And then in 1930, at age 73, Milton Hershey began the most puzzling project of his life, High Point, a mansion so elaborate, so expensive, so wildly disproportionate to any conceivable need, that its very existence demands explanation, because Milton already had a perfectly good house, the homestead, a comfortable mansion where he'd lived with Kitty, and he lived alone now, a widower who spent most of his time at the factory or traveling, so why build another house? And not just any house but a palace, a 22-room Spanish colonial revival fantasy. With Moorish influences, designed by noted Philadelphia architect C. Emlyn Urban, who had designed the Hotel Hershey and other buildings in town, and the location Milton chose was as revealing as the design, Pat's Hill, the highest point for miles, a windswept ridge overlooking the entire Hershey enterprise, the factory, the town, the school, the farms, everything Milton had built visible from this elevated position, and the symbolism was obvious, almost embarrassingly so. Here was the Chocolate King building his castle on the hill, literally above his domain, and construction began in 1930, and immediately it was clear this wasn't a normal building project, because Milton was involved in every detail, not just approving plans but obsessing over tiles, insisting that certain stones be imported from specific quarries, demanding that doorways be enlarged or reduced by inches, and the house was designed as a showcase for his collection, because after Kitty's death Milton had become an obsessive collector, traveling to Europe and buying Spanish and Italian antiques, tiles, furniture, artworks, entire room panels that were shipped back to Pennsylvania and incorporated into High Point's design, and the house was built around these acquisitions, rooms designed to fit specific ceilings or wall panels, and the construction was expensive, far more expensive than initially budgeted, and it dragged on for years, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933. And Milton kept changing his mind, kept demanding alterations, kept adding new elements, a reflecting pool, a fountain courtyard, elaborate gardens. And workers who labored on High Point later recalled that Milton visited constantly, sometimes daily, walking through rooms with Urban, pointing at things, demanding changes, and there was something manic about it, something that suggested Milton wasn't really building a house to live in but rather working through something, processing something, and then in 1934, with the house perhaps 80% complete, the exterior finished, most rooms built, but interior details incomplete, no furnishings installed, gardens unfinished, Milton suddenly stopped, just stopped, he dismissed the construction crews, told Urban the project was suspended indefinitely, and when asked why, he gave no clear answer, just vague references to the Depression, to economic prudence, to not wanting to be ostentatious, but none of this made sense because he'd already spent millions, the house was nearly finished, and the Depression hadn't stopped him from completing the Hotel Hershey a year earlier, so the real reason had to be something else, something Milton couldn't or wouldn't articulate, and the most convincing explanation, the one that makes psychological sense even if it can't be definitively proven, is that as High Point neared completion, as it transformed from dream to reality, Milton finally confronted what he'd been avoiding, that he didn't want to live there, that the house he'd obsessed over for 4 years represented everything he'd lost, Kitty, the possibility of family, the domestic happiness that had eluded him, and that moving into High Point would mean finally accepting that he would live alone in a palace designed for no one, that every room would echo with absence, that the castle on the hill was not a triumph but a monument to failure, to childlessness, to the fundamental isolation of his position, because what is the point of building paradise if you have no one to share it with? And so Milton walked away, left High Point unfinished, a shell, and he never lived there, never even spent a night there so far as anyone knows, and the house sat empty on its hill, visible from all over town, a constant reminder of something, though what exactly no one could quite say, and Milton continued living in the homestead and working at the factory, and he redirected his energy entirely to the school, expanding it, pouring more money into it, personally approving every new building, every curriculum change, and in 1918 he and Kitty had deeded control of the Hershey Chocolate Company to the Hershey Trust Company for the benefit of the school, meaning the orphanage would own and control one of America's largest candy companies in perpetuity, and by 1940 the school had over 1,000 students, all boys, all living on working farms scattered around the area, and Milton visited constantly, attending chapel services, sports events, graduation ceremonies, and former students would later recall that Milton knew their names, remembered their backgrounds, asked about their progress, and for Milton this was family, the only family he would ever have, these orphaned boys who would carry his name and his values forward, who would inherit his empire, and the psychological mechanism here is obvious. If you can't have children, create an institution that produces children indefinitely, ensure that your legacy consists not of biological descendants but of thousands of young men who owe their education, their values, their very opportunities to you. Become father not to a few but to multitudes, and it worked, at least for Milton, who spent his final years shuttling between the factory, the school, and the Hotel Hershey, where he maintained a suite and held court, receiving visitors, business associates, school administrators, and he lived simply despite his wealth, wearing plain suits, eating in the employee cafeteria, driving himself around town in a modest car, and this affected simplicity was partly genuine. Milton never lost certain Mennonite sensibilities about ostentation, and partly performance, part of the carefully cultivated image of the benevolent patriarch who lived among his people, though of course he didn't really live among them, he lived above them in every sense, in the homestead mansion, with servants, with complete control over their employment and housing, and the power dynamic was never equal even if Milton preferred to pretend it was, and meanwhile High Point sat empty. And during World War II it was briefly considered as a hospital or office space but never used, and after the war it continued sitting, the elements beginning to take their toll, rain seeping through incomplete roof sections, windows broken by vandals or storms, and the house that Milton built but never inhabited became Hershey's great architectural mystery, visible to everyone, accessible to no one, and Milton died in 1945 at age 88, never having resolved the High Point question. And in his final years when asked about it he would change the subject or make vague references to maybe finishing it someday, but he never did, and after his death the house became even more problematic, because legally it belonged to the Hershey Trust, which meant it belonged to the school, and what was the school supposed to do with an unfinished palace on a hill, and the trust considered various options, completing it as a museum, selling it, demolishing it, but did nothing, perhaps out of respect for Milton's wishes. Or perhaps because no one could agree on what those wishes had been, and so High Point continued its decay, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, slowly deteriorating, the Spanish tiles that Milton had obsessed over cracking in Pennsylvania winters, the elaborate plasterwork he'd imported crumbling from water damage, the gardens he'd planned becoming overgrown and then reverting to forest, and local teenagers would sneak up to High Point on dares, break in through broken windows, explore the empty rooms, and they reported that it was eerie, that the house felt haunted not by ghosts, but by potential, by the life that was supposed to happen there but never did, and the contrast was striking. Down in the valley, Hershey was thriving, the chocolate company was one of America's biggest, the town was prosperous, the school was educating thousands of students, Milton's vision had been realized in every way except this one, except High Point, which stood as a rebuke to everything else. A reminder that something had gone wrong, that some wound had never healed, and the house became a kind of open secret in Hershey. Everyone knew about it, no one talked about it much, it wasn't featured in company tours or town histories, it was the thing you didn't mention, and this silence itself is revealing, because what High Point represented was too uncomfortable to address. It represented Milton's childlessness, his loneliness, his inability to find satisfaction even in spectacular success, and these were not themes that fit the official narrative of Hershey as paradise, of Milton as the benevolent chocolate king who gave workers and orphans everything. Because if Milton had everything, why did he build a palace and then refuse to live in it? What does it say about the American dream if achieving it leaves you so profoundly alone that you can't bear to inhabit your own monument? And these questions were dangerous, they threatened the carefully constructed mythology, so High Point was left to decay in silence, and then in the 1980s and 1990s, as Milton's generation died off and new historians began examining the Hershey story with more critical eyes, some uncomfortable truths emerged. Because the paradise Milton built was not quite what it appeared, the town of Hershey was prosperous but completely controlled, the company owned virtually everything, housing, stores, utilities, and workers who questioned management or tried to organize unions were dismissed and evicted, their entire lives upended, and Milton himself had been a fierce opponent of organized labor, refusing to recognize unions even during the bitter 1937 strike when Hershey workers, inspired by the sit-down strike sweeping American industry, occupied the factory and demanded recognition, and Milton, then 80 years old, was furious, saw it as personal betrayal. How dare his workers, his children, essentially, defy him, and he didn't negotiate. He called in dairy farmers from the surrounding area, loyal men who depended on the chocolate company buying their milk. And these farmers, armed with clubs, stormed the factory and physically beat the strikers, injuring dozens, and the strike collapsed, and Milton won, but the cost was his carefully cultivated image of benevolence, because how benevolent is a patriarch who responds to dissent with violence, and the historical record shows that Hershey, for all its parks and amenities, was fundamentally a company town where Milton's word was law and deviation was punished, and the school too, upon examination, revealed complications, because yes, it educated orphans, but only white orphans until 1968. When forced by court order to integrate, and the school maintained strict rules, students were essentially indentured, required to work on farms, forbidden from leaving campus without permission, subjected to religious instruction whether they wanted it or not, and while many graduates remembered it fondly, others described it as oppressive, a place where individuality was suppressed in favor of obedience and conformity, and the school's governance structure, controlled by a self-perpetuating board of trustees with no oversight, led to scandals in the 1990s and 2000s, executives paying themselves millions while student enrollment declined, spending money on office renovations and travel rather than student services, and finally in 2016 Pennsylvania's Attorney General had to intervene, forcing reforms and reminding everyone that the school existed to serve orphans, not to enrich administrators, but these problems, these uncomfortable realities, had been built into the structure from the beginning. Because Milton had created an institution he controlled absolutely and assumed his successors would maintain his vision, but he provided no mechanism for accountability, no way for anyone to question whether the vision still served its stated purpose, and this is the danger of benevolent dictatorship. It works as long as the dictator is truly benevolent, but once he's gone, the structure remains with none of the original motivation, and power corrupts even when inherited from chocolate kings, and so the Hershey Trust, which Milton envisioned as the eternal guardian of his legacy, became by the late 20th century a cautionary tale about unaccountable institutional power, and through all of this High Point continued sitting on its hill, still empty, still deteriorating, and in 1988 the trust finally made a decision. The house would be demolished, it was too expensive to maintain, too expensive to complete, it had no practical use, and it was dangerous. Structurally unsound after nearly 60 years of exposure, and demolition began, but a strange thing happened, the house wouldn't come down easily, the construction was too solid, Milton had built it to last centuries, and the demolition contractors discovered that the imported stone, the steel reinforcement, the craftsmanship Milton had insisted upon, made High Point far more substantial than they'd expected, and it took months to fully demolish it, and during the demolition some of the artifacts were salvaged. Tiles and stonework and architectural elements, and these were stored in various Hershey facilities, and some were eventually incorporated into renovations of other Hershey buildings, so pieces of High Point, fragments of Milton's abandoned dream, are scattered throughout the town, embedded in walls and floors, and this seems appropriate. The palace he couldn't inhabit now literally built into the structures of the community he did create, and today, if you visit the site of High Point, you'll find almost nothing. The house is gone, the foundation has been filled in, trees have grown over everything, and only if you know where to look can you find traces, a section of retaining wall, some terrace stones, a fragment of the reflecting pool, and there's no marker, no plaque, nothing to tell you that here stood Milton Hershey's greatest folly, his monument to loneliness, his unfinished palace, and this absence is its own kind of statement, because Hershey as a town is obsessed with its founder. His name is everywhere, his image on signs and statues, his story told in the Hershey Story Museum and the Hershey Gardens and countless books and documentaries, but High Point is erased, written out, the one part of Milton's story that doesn't fit the narrative, and what does it mean that a town built by a man, named for that man, owned by institutions that man created, can't acknowledge the part of his story that reveals his humanity, his failure, his loneliness, because that's what High Point was. Not a palace but a confession, not a monument to success, but an admission that success hadn't been enough, that all the chocolate factories and planned communities and orphanages in the world couldn't fill the emptiness left by Kitty's death and the absence of children, and Milton built High Point because he thought building things solved problems. That's what he'd always done. Every challenge in his life he'd met by building something, a better candy factory, a model town, a school, and so when faced with existential loneliness he tried to build his way out of it, construct a physical space so beautiful, so perfect, that living in it would somehow compensate for living alone, but of course it didn't work. You can't build away grief, you can't construct yourself out of isolation, and I think Milton realized this as High Point neared completion, realized that the house he'd obsessed over was just a house, that moving into it would change nothing, that he would still be a widower without children no matter how many Spanish tiles decorated his walls, and so he stopped, walked away, left it unfinished because finishing it would mean confronting its failure to solve the problem it was built to solve, and there's something profoundly sad about this, about a man who changed American candy manufacturing, who employed thousands, who educated generations of orphans, who built an entire town from scratch, but who couldn't build himself a home he wanted to live in. And High Point's story is a counterpoint to every other Hershey story, a reminder that even self-made millionaires are human. That wealth doesn't insulate you from loss, that you can control everything, factories, towns, institutions, and still be powerless against the fundamental loneliness of the human condition, and perhaps that's why High Point had to be erased, demolished, because its existence was too honest, too revealing. It showed the wound beneath the benevolence, the emptiness beneath the empire. And American mythology doesn't have space for that complexity. We want our self-made men to be satisfied with their success, to find fulfillment in achievement, and when they don't, when achievement reveals itself as insufficient, we don't know what to do with that information, so we demolish it, literally, we fill in the foundation and plant trees and pretend it never existed, but of course it did exist. High Point was real. Milton spent years and millions building it, and then he spent the rest of his life not living in it. And that negative space, that absence, tells us more about Milton Hershey than all the statues and museums and hagiographic biographies combined, because absence is always more honest than presence, what we don't do more revealing than what we do, and Milton didn't live in his palace, that's the fact we have to sit with, and what it reveals is that paradise, whether built from chocolate or stone, means nothing if you're there alone, that legacy is cold comfort when you have no heirs of your own blood, that institutions, no matter how well endowed, are not children, and orphans, no matter how much you love them, are not your sons, and Milton knew this, had to know it, which is why High Point haunted him, why he built it but couldn't finish it, why he never moved in, because doing so would mean admitting that this was it, this was the life he'd built, magnificent and hollow, and he couldn't admit that, so he left the house empty and focused on the school, on the business, on anything but the truth that his palace revealed, and today when people visit Hershey, they see the chocolate factory and the amusement park and the Hotel Hershey and they think they're seeing Milton's legacy, and they are, but they're seeing the edited version, the version that makes sense, that fits into American mythology about hard work and success and giving back, and what they're not seeing is High Point, the shadow legacy, the thing that didn't fit, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some truths are too uncomfortable for tourism, but I would argue that High Point is the Most important part of the story, because it's the part that makes Milton human, that transforms him from icon into person, that shows us that even chocolate kings bleed, and more than that, High Point forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the entire Hershey enterprise, because if Milton built the town and the school and the factory as substitutes for family, as ways to be father and patriarch because he couldn't be father and husband, then what does that make Hershey itself? What does it mean to live in someone else's substitute family, to be educated in someone else's compensation mechanism? And these questions don't have comfortable answers, but they're worth asking, because the Hershey story is fundamentally American, the self-made man, the benevolent industrialist, the planned community. And if there's darkness in that story, if the Chocolate King's palace was actually a prison he built for himself, then maybe we need to examine our own assumptions about success and legacy. And the American dream, because Milton achieved everything that dream promises: wealth, power, influence, immortality through institutions that bear his name, and yet he built a palace he couldn't live in, and if that doesn't make us question the dream itself, what will? And so High Point stands, or rather doesn't stand, exists now only in photographs and memories and scattered artifacts built into other buildings, as a monument to what the official story can't contain, to the loneliness that wealth can't solve, to the fundamental human need for connection that no amount of chocolate or controlled communities or endowed schools can satisfy. And Milton Hershey died in 1945 never having resolved this, never having found a way to live with the absence at the center of his success, and his town continues, his company continues, his school continues, all of them thriving, all of them successful by any conventional measure. But somewhere on Pat's Hill, where trees now grow over filled foundations and teenagers still occasionally explore looking for remnants, there's an absence that tells a different story. A ghost palace that testifies to the limits of American ambition, to the truth that you can build anything except the thing you actually need, and maybe that's the real lesson of High Point, not inspiration but warning, not triumph but tragedy, a reminder that every empire has a hollow at its center, every success story an unfinished palace somewhere, and the question we should be asking isn't why Milton built High Point, but why we've spent so many decades trying to forget it existed, because that forgetting, that demolition, that erasure, is itself a story about what we're willing to see and what we need to hide, about which parts of our histories we preserve and which we bury under trees and silence, and the fact that you can visit Hershey today and learn everything about Milton except the most important thing, that he built his heaven and then couldn't bear to live in it, tells you everything you need to know about American mythology, about the stories we tell ourselves about success and satisfaction and the good life. Because if we admitted that the Chocolate King died lonely despite everything he built, if we preserved High Point as a museum to American ambition's limitations rather than demolishing it in embarrassment, we'd have to confront some uncomfortable truths about what we value and what we sacrifice and whether the pursuit of legacy is actually worth the cost. And Hershey the town doesn't want to confront that, and Hershey the company doesn't want to confront that, and America doesn't want to confront that, so High Point was demolished, erased, forgotten, and we tell the other story instead, the clean story, the story without shadows, and millions of tourists visit every year and eat chocolate and ride roller coasters and think they know Milton Hershey's story, but they don't, because the story isn't complete without the palace on the hill, without the empty rooms and the Spanish tiles and the reflecting pool that never reflected anything except Milton's own absence, and that's what makes High Point essential rather than peripheral, central rather than marginal, because it's the place where the mythology breaks down, where the curtain tears and we see what's behind it, a man, just a man, immensely successful and profoundly sad, who could build anything except what he needed most, who could control everything except his own loneliness, and who in the end left us not just a chocolate empire but a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing monuments with meaning, institutions with intimacy, and legacy with love, because Milton Hershey gave everything to the future, his fortune, his town, his very name, and yet he couldn't give himself a reason to live in the palace he'd built, and that failure, that very human failure, is his most important gift to us if we're willing to receive it, because it tells us that maybe we're building the wrong things, chasing the wrong successes, and that perhaps what we need isn't more magnificent architecture or better planned communities or larger legacies, but simply someone to come home to, someone to share it all with, someone who makes paradise real by inhabiting it with us, and without that, all the chocolate in the world tastes like loneliness, all the palaces echo empty, And all our monuments become tombs we build while we're still alive, waiting for death to make them appropriate. And that's the dark story High Point tells, the truth that had to be demolished because it was too painful to preserve, and the question that haunts Pat's Hill where nothing stands anymore is the same question that should haunt us: what are we building, and will we be able to live in it when it's finished, or will we too walk away, leaving our dreams empty, our palaces unfinished, our success revealed as magnificent failure, because that's what High Point was, magnificent failure. And Milton's greatest achievement was not the chocolate or the town or the school but his honesty, even if unconscious, in building this palace and then refusing to live in it, thereby showing all of us what we're too afraid to admit, that you can have everything and nothing at the same time, that the castle on the hill is coldest when you're there alone, and yet the erasure of High Point, complete as it seemed by the 1990s, could not fully contain the questions it raised, because the story had a way of surfacing in unexpected places, in the memories of construction workers who had labored on the mansion and who, in their old age, gave interviews to local historians, describing Milton's daily visits, his obsessive attention to detail, his sudden mood shifts from enthusiasm to melancholy, and these oral histories, collected by the Hershey Community Archives in the 1980s and 90s, painted a picture quite different from the official narrative, because the workers remembered that Milton would sometimes stand alone in the unfinished rooms for long periods, not inspecting anything, just standing there, looking out the windows at the town below, and one elderly carpenter recalled asking Milton if he was excited to move in once the house was finished, and Milton had replied, "I don't know if I'll ever live here, but it needs to be built anyway," a statement so cryptic, so sad, that the carpenter remembered it 60 years later, and these fragments, these memories, began to accumulate in the archives, and scholars studying Hershey's history in the 2000s and 2010s started to piece together a more complex portrait, one that challenged the Chocolate King mythology, and what emerged was a picture of a man driven not by benevolence but by an almost pathological need to control, to build, to leave a mark so large that death itself couldn't erase it, and this need was born not from confidence but from profound insecurity, from the childhood instability caused by his father's failures, from the shame of his limited education in a world that valued formal learning, from his marriage to a Catholic woman in a Protestant community that never fully accepted the union, from his inability to have children in an era when childlessness was seen as a mark of divine disfavor or personal inadequacy, and every building Milton erected, every institution he endowed, every carefully planned street and park, was an argument against these insecurities, a physical manifestation of worth, of permanence, of maturing, and High Point was supposed to be the culmination, the final proof that Milton Hershey had transcended his origins, had become not just wealthy but cultivated, not just successful but refined, a man who could live in a Spanish palace because he had earned the right to live anywhere. But the problem with building your self-worth into architecture is that architecture doesn't care, stone and tile and carved wood don't validate you, they just sit there, beautiful and inert, and when High Point was nearly complete and Milton walked through its empty rooms, he must have realized that the house proved nothing, changed nothing, that he was still the same semi-educated Mennonite farm boy who'd failed at his first business, still the childless widower eating alone, and the palace couldn't transform him into someone different, couldn't make him belong to a class that would always see him as nouveau riche, couldn't bring Kitty back or give him the children he'd wanted. And so the house became unbearable, not because it was flawed but because it was perfect, because its perfection revealed the futility of the entire exercise, and walking away was the only honest response, an admission that you can't build yourself into a different person, that monuments don't redeem, they only memorialize, and what High Point was memorializing was loss, and who wants to live in a mausoleum, and this psychological reading, while unprovable, makes sense of the otherwise inexplicable decision to abandon a nearly finished multimillion-dollar mansion, and it also makes sense of Milton's intensified focus on the school after 1934, because the school offered something High Point couldn't. It was alive, it changed, it produced results in the form of educated boys who went into the world carrying Milton's name and values, and if Milton couldn't be a father in the biological sense, he could be a father to hundreds, eventually thousands. And this mass fatherhood had the advantage of never getting too intimate, never forcing Milton to confront his emotional limitations in the way that raising actual children would have, because the school was an institution, he could visit, inspect, approve, but he didn't have to do the daily work of parenting, didn't have to navigate the messy emotional reality of family life, and this distance, this institutionalization of fatherhood, suited Milton perfectly, because it allowed him to experience the pride and legacy of paternity without the vulnerability and intimacy that actual fatherhood requires, and in this sense the school was another kind of palace, as carefully controlled and emotionally safe as High Point was supposed to be, and the boys who lived there, while materially provided for, were also kept at arm's length, because Milton's involvement, though genuine, was always that of a benefactor visiting his charges, never a father living with his sons, and former students from Milton's era describe him as kind but distant, generous but formal, a man who clearly cared but who never quite connected, and this emotional unavailability, this inability to truly let people in, was Milton's fundamental limitation, and it shaped everything he built, because all of his creations, the factory, the town, the school, High Point, were exercises in control, attempts to design human environments so thoroughly that spontaneity, unpredictability, and genuine intimacy became unnecessary, and this worked, more or less. In a business context, the chocolate factory was extraordinarily efficient, but it failed utterly in the personal realm, because you cannot design your way to love, you cannot control your way to connection, and High Point stands, or stood, as evidence of this failure, a house designed to make Milton feel at home that instead made him feel more alone than ever, and the tragedy is that Milton almost certainly didn't understand why, he just knew that he couldn't live there, that the thought of inhabiting those perfect rooms filled him with dread rather than anticipation, and so he walked away, and he never spoke about it honestly, never explained it even to himself, and the people around him, employees and trustees and town officials, didn't push him, because you didn't push Milton Hershey. His authority was absolute, and if he decided to abandon a palace, well, that was his right, and the financial waste, the architectural loss, the sheer strangeness of the decision, were all subordinated to the principle that Milton knew best, which was the foundational myth of Hershey, Pennsylvania, that the Chocolate King's judgment was infallible, that his decisions, however inexplicable, served some higher purpose, and this myth persisted even as evidence accumulated that Milton was human, fallible, capable of mistakes and misjudgments, and the 1937 strike should have shattered the myth, the violence of the company's response, the farmers beating workers with clubs while Milton watched from a distance. This should have revealed the iron fist beneath the benevolent glove, but the myth adapted, incorporated the strike as an aberration, a moment when ungrateful workers forgot their place, and Milton's reputation survived largely intact, and High Point, which might have served as another crack in the myth, was instead hidden, literally demolished, and the mythology continued, and this is how power perpetuates itself, not through crude domination but through story control, through the careful curation of which facts get emphasized and which get buried, and Hershey the institution, the trust and the company and the town, had every incentive to maintain the benevolent patriarch story because that story justified the entire social structure, the company ownership of housing, the trust's control of the school, the perpetual governance by self-selecting boards. All of this was legitimate as long as Milton was a saint, but if Milton was actually a complicated, damaged, emotionally limited man who built monuments to compensate for inner emptiness, then maybe the structures he created should be questioned, reformed, democratized, and the powers that be in Hershey didn't want that questioning, so High Point had to go, and with it went the most visible evidence of Milton's humanity, his failure, his limitations, and what was left was the sanitized version, the version that could be taught to schoolchildren and sold to tourists, and this sanitized version dominated for decades, but you can't completely erase truth, it has a way of seeping back, like water through an incomplete roof, and by the early 2000s, as a new generation of historians applied more critical methodologies to the Hershey story, uncomfortable truths began to emerge, not just about High Point but about the entire enterprise, because when you start pulling one thread, the whole fabric begins to unravel, and researchers discovered that the Hershey Industrial School, for all its progressive reputation, had been deeply conservative in practice. It refused to admit black students until 1968, not out of thoughtless prejudice but out of deliberate policy. The trust argued that admitting black students would upset white donors and local sensibilities, and Milton himself, though he'd been born before the Civil War and could perhaps be excused for the racial attitudes of his era, had done nothing to challenge segregation. The school was white by design, and this fact, uncomfortable and undeniable, complicated the benevolent patriarch narrative. Because benevolence that excludes based on race isn't benevolence, it's paternalism at best and white supremacy at worst, and the same critical lens revealed other issues. The school's admissions criteria were restrictive in ways that had nothing to do with need. Students had to be mentally and physically sound, which excluded disabled children. They had to come from moral families, which in practice meant excluding children of divorced or unmarried parents, and these restrictions, which Milton had established, reflected not universal charity but selective charity, helping only those deemed worthy. According to early 20th century middle-class Protestant values, and this selectivity undermined the narrative that Milton was helping all orphans, he was helping some orphans, the ones who fit his vision, and this is a very different kind of charity, less generous and more controlling, and when you combine this with the revelations about the trust's financial mismanagement in the 1990s and 2000s, the executives paying themselves enormous salaries while the student population declined, spending lavishly on investments and facilities that had nothing to do with education, you start to see a pattern, that the institutions Milton created were never really about the beneficiaries, the workers, or the students, but about Milton, about his need for control, for legacy, for monuments, and the people who came after him, the trustees and executives, inherited this structure and used it for their own enrichment, because that's what unaccountable power always does, it serves itself, and the tragedy is that Milton set this up. He created institutions with no democratic oversight, no accountability to the public or the beneficiaries, just perpetual control by self-selecting boards, and he did this because he trusted himself absolutely and assumed his successors would maintain his vision, but trust and vision die with the visionary, and what's left is just power, and power without accountability corrupts, always. And so the institutions Milton created to ensure his benevolent legacy became, in many ways, instruments of the opposite, vehicles for enrichment and control that served administrators rather than students, and when Pennsylvania's Attorney General finally intervened in 2016, forcing the trust to reform, to increase student enrollment, to redirect funds toward actual education rather than executive compensation, it was an admission that Milton's design had failed, that benevolent dictatorship doesn't work even when the dictator is benevolent, because the structure outlives the man, and the structure is what matters, and Milton's structure was authoritarian, paternalistic, undemocratic, and the fact that it produced some good outcomes, many students were educated, many workers housed, doesn't change the fundamental problem that people's lives were controlled by an institution they had no voice in, no vote in, no power over. And this is the dark truth that High Point whispered and that the school's history screams. Milton Hershey was not a benefactor but a controller, not a giver but a designer of dependent relationships, and everything he built, from the factory to the town to the school to the abandoned palace, was about imposing his vision on the world, shaping human lives according to his plan, and the fact that his plan was relatively enlightened by early 20th century standards doesn't make it less controlling, less paternalistic, less fundamentally at odds with human dignity and autonomy, and High Point, in this light, becomes not an aberration but the purest expression of Milton's project, a completely controlled environment, every tile chosen, every room designed, every view calculated, a total work of art that was also a total prison, and Milton couldn't live there because on some level he recognized what it was, recognized that the logical endpoint of his need for control was a beautiful cage, and he couldn't quite bring himself to lock himself inside, and so he walked away, but he didn't dismantle the other cages. The factory where workers had no union rights, the town where residents had no property rights, the school where students had no autonomy, those cages he maintained until his death, and they persisted after his death, and they still exist today in modified forms, because Hershey, Pennsylvania remains a company town in all but name, the trust still owns vast amounts of property, still exerts enormous influence over local politics and economics, and the school, while reformed, still operates on the basic principle Milton established, that wealthy institutions know better than poor families what children need, that removing children from their communities and raising them in controlled environments is charity rather than social engineering, and these assumptions, so deeply embedded in the Hershey story, are worth questioning, because they reflect a particularly American form of benevolence that's inseparable from control, that assumes the wealthy have not just resources but wisdom, not just money but moral authority, and that the proper response to poverty and Orphanhood is not to address systemic issues or empower communities but to remove the deserving individuals and shape them according to middle-class values, and Milton Hershey didn't invent this model, he inherited it from earlier reformers and industrialists, but he perfected it, scaled it up, made it permanent by endowing it with a chocolate fortune. And the result is an institution that will likely exist for centuries, educating students according to principles established by a man who died in 1945, and there's something profoundly anti-democratic about this. About the dead hand of the past controlling the present, about one man's vision, however well-intentioned, shaping lives in perpetuity, and High Point, if it had been preserved rather than demolished, could have served as a museum for exploring these questions, a space where visitors could confront the contradictions of American philanthropy, the way benevolence and control intertwine, the way monuments to generosity can also be monuments to ego, and the way even chocolate kings die lonely when they confuse building institutions with building relationships. But High Point wasn't preserved, it was erased, and that erasure itself is instructive, because it shows how uncomfortable we are with complexity, with ambiguity, with heroes who are also flawed humans. We want our billionaire philanthropists to be pure, to be saints, to justify the inequality that makes their philanthropy possible. Because if we admitted that Carnegie's libraries and Rockefeller's universities and Hershey's school were as much about ego and control as about generosity, we'd have to question the entire model of billionaire philanthropy. We'd have to ask why we accept a system where individuals accumulate such vast wealth that they can unilaterally reshape society according to their personal visions, and we'd have to consider alternatives, like democratic control of resources, like taxation and public investment, like systems where communities decide their own futures rather than waiting for benevolent millionaires to bestow gifts from above. And these questions are dangerous to the established order, they threaten the mythology that justifies extreme inequality, and so they're not asked, and the evidence that might provoke them, places like High Point, are demolished, and the stories are sanitized, and the Chocolate King remains a hero in the official narrative. And millions of people eat Hershey bars and visit Hershey Park and never know about the palace on the hill, never hear about the 1937 strike, never learn about the decades of racial exclusion at the school, never confront the complicated, troubling, human reality of Milton Hershey. And this ignorance is not accidental, it's cultivated, maintained, because it serves the interests of the institutions that control the story, the trust and the company and the town, all of which benefit from the benevolent patriarch myth, and challenging that myth, telling the full story including High Point and the strike and the exclusions and the loneliness and the control, would undermine the legitimacy of these institutions, would open them to criticism and demands for reform, and so the myth persists, and the truth is buried, literally and figuratively, under trees and silence and selective memory. And this is the final tragedy of High Point, not that it was built and abandoned, not that it was demolished and forgotten, but that it could have taught us something essential about wealth and power and the American dream, something we desperately need to learn, which is that building monuments doesn't make you immortal, that controlling everything doesn't make you secure, that wealth without connection is poverty of a different kind, and that the palaces we build, whether of stone or institutions or mythology, are only as meaningful as the human relationships they shelter. And Milton Hershey built palaces everywhere, factories and towns and schools. But he couldn't build a home, couldn't create the intimate human space where he could actually live, and that failure, that very human failure, is the most valuable thing he left us, because it shows us what not to do. It warns us that the path of control and monuments leads nowhere, that legacy is cold comfort, that institutions are poor substitutes for love, and that sometimes the most successful people are the most profoundly unsuccessful at the things that actually matter. And if we could preserve that lesson, if we could build a museum on Pat's Hill where High Point stood and tell the full story, the triumphant and the tragic, the generous and the controlling, the chocolate empire and the empty palace, we might learn something, might begin to question our own assumptions about success and wealth and what makes a life well lived. But we didn't preserve it, we demolished it, and maybe that's the most American thing of all, to destroy the evidence that complicates our myths, to bury the truth that challenges our stories, and to continue believing, against all evidence, that wealth is virtue, that billionaires are benevolent, that control is charity, and that the Chocolate King who died alone in his hotel suite, who never lived in the palace he built, who poured everything into institutions and nothing into intimate human connection, was somehow living the dream rather than exposing its emptiness. and so High Point is gone, and Milton's full story remains untold in any official capacity, and Hershey, Pennsylvania continues to sell chocolate and nostalgia and the fantasy that benevolent capitalism works. That company towns are paradises, that philanthropy solves poverty, and visitors eat their Hershey bars and tour the town and never ask the questions that High Point would force them to ask if it still stood. What was he running from, what was he building toward, and why couldn't he live in what he built? Because those questions don't have comfortable answers, and comfortable answers are what we want, what we pay for, what we demand from our tourist destinations and our national myths, and Hershey gives us comfortable answers, sells them by the chocolate bar, by the roller coaster ride, by the carefully curated museum exhibit, and we consume these answers gratefully, because the alternative, confronting the complexity, the loneliness, the failure at the heart of even spectacular success, is too disturbing, too threatening to our own dreams of wealth and achievement, and so we demolish High Point. Literally and metaphorically, we erase the evidence, we simplify the story, we make Milton a hero uncomplicated by humanity, and we lose the opportunity to learn from his mistakes, to see in his empty palace a warning about our own values, our own pursuits, our own confusion of monuments with meaning, and perhaps this is the ultimate lesson, not anything Milton intended to teach but something his life teaches despite itself. That the grandest buildings are the emptiest when we build them to escape rather than to embrace life, that institutions are poor substitutes for intimacy. That control is the opposite of connection, that legacy matters far less than love, and that dying wealthy in a hotel suite, surrounded by an empire but alone, is not success but tragedy, and the chocolate, however sweet, cannot cover the taste of that truth, and the palace, however beautiful, cannot shelter us from the cold wind of that emptiness, and so High Point stands, or fails to stand, as the monument Milton didn't intend to build, the confession he didn't mean to make, the truth that survived his death even though he demolished it before dying, because you cannot erase truth completely, you can only drive it underground, where it waits, patient as limestone, heavy as legacy, ready to surface again whenever someone cares enough to dig, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to tell the full story, and maybe that someone is reading this now, standing on Pat's Hill where the palace stood, looking down at the chocolate town in the valley, and understanding finally what Milton couldn't say, that he built everything except what he needed, controlled everything except what mattered, and died having succeeded at everything except living, and that this precisely, is what we must learn from High Point's ruins, that success without connection is failure, that monuments without meaning are tombs, that control without love is prison, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not to build another palace but to walk away from the ones we've already built, to abandon our monuments to ego and control, to stop designing perfect worlds and start living in imperfect reality, to choose intimacy over institution, presence over legacy, love over stone, and maybe, just maybe, to understand that the chocolate king's greatest gift was not the chocolate or the town or the school but the palace he couldn't live in, the monument to loneliness that teaches us, if we're willing to learn, that the only palace worth building is the one you can share, the only monument worth creating is a life fully lived with others, and the only legacy worth leaving is the memory of having loved and been loved, because everything else, all the stone and tile and carved wood, all the institutions and endowments, all the towns named after us and schools funded in perpetuity, turns to dust and silence and trees growing over foundations, and what remains, the only thing that ever remains, is the answer to the simplest question, did you love well, and were you loved in return, and Milton Hershey's answer, echoing from his empty palace on the hill, is no, and that no. That absence, that silence, is his final lesson, his most important legacy, the truth his demolished palace still speaks to anyone willing to listen.